On the morning of June the 6th, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history began. More than 150,000 Allied soldiers, mostly Americans, British and Canadians, landed in Normandy, facing fierce German resistance. This maneuver, codenamed Operation Neptune, was the first phase of the strategic plan Overlord, whose ultimate goal was the fall of the Third Reich. For 4 years, Hitler had fortified the French coast with bunkers, barbed wire and mines, convinced that the attack would come at Calais. However, the Allies opted for Normandy, surprising the German troops. Despite heavy casualties on beaches like Omaha, they managed to advance inland. This landing was key in World War II. After expelling the Nazis from North Africa and southern Italy, the Allies needed to open a new front in Western Europe. With the conquest of Normandy, Germany was trapped between the Soviets in the east and the Allied forces in the west. That day marked the beginning of the end for Hitler. How were the massacres on the beaches of Normandy experienced, and how brutal was the German resistance? Operation Overlord, the largest landing in history. Since the disastrous evacuation of the British Army at Dunkirk and the surrender of France in the summer of 1940, Germany had taken absolute control of Western Europe. For years, any attempt by the Allies to recover the territory was impossible. However, in 1944, the situation took a dramatic turn. The Axis troops were retreating on all fronts. Both the Third Reich, in its struggle against the Soviet Union, and Japan in the Pacific War, were suffering constant defeats. Faced with this scenario, the United States, the United Kingdom and Canada decided it was time to return to the continent and open a new front of combat. The first proposal to invade Western Europe arose in 1942, but was discarded due to a lack of resources and the failure of the Canadian Army at Dieppe. Instead, the Allies opted to attack North Africa in Operation Torch, and later the island of Sicily with Operation Husky. A year later, at the Quebec Conference of 1943, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill agreed to land in France. However, before taking that step, they prioritized an invasion of southern Italy, which led to that country breaking its alliance with Germany. Finally, in November 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill met with Joseph Stalin and confirmed the launch of the long-awaited Second Front that would relieve pressure on the Red Army in the east. The choice of France as the point of invasion was not easy. Churchill preferred to land in the Balkans, specifically in Yugoslavia or Istria, to unite his troops with Josip Tito's partisans and advance toward Germany, thus avoiding the expansion of communism in Central Europe. However, Roosevelt, whose country led the offensive, insisted that the landing should take place on the French Atlantic coast. With no other option, Churchill focused on choosing the exact location for the invasion, exploring options from Norway to Spain. British Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten led the analysis and ruled out several locations: the Pas de Calais for being too obvious, Holland for its canals, Scandinavia for the ice, Belgium for the strong sea currents, and Brittany for the lack of suitable ports. After evaluating all the options, only 2 possible zones remained: Upper Normandy between Dieppe and Le Havre, and Lower Normandy between Cherbourg and Caen. Finally, the Allies opted for the latter. The plan, codenamed Operation Overlord, was placed in the hands of American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. Known as Ike, this 54-year-old military man set up his headquarters at Southwick House, Portsmouth, and gathered his command team: Marshal Arthur Tedder as Deputy Commander, Bernard Montgomery in charge of ground forces, Admiral Bertram Ramsay in command of the Navy, and Marshal Lee Mallory leading the Air Force. The strategy was divided into 2 operations: Operation Neptune, focused on the naval invasion, and Operation Fortitude, in charge of air maneuvers. As for the ground forces, they were organized under the 21st Army Group. The deployment of Operation Overlord covered an 80-kilometer strip in Normandy, divided into 5 sectors: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. American forces took charge of the first two, while the British and Canadians led the rest. The assault began with the landing of tens of thousands of soldiers organized into various infantry divisions and special units. Alongside them, airborne forces conducted strategic jumps during the early morning, securing key points such as bridges and roads. In the air, thousands of combat, transport and bomber aircraft provided support, while at sea, nearly 7,000 vessels made up the imposing Allied fleet. To sustain the invasion, logistical innovations such as floating ports and an underwater pipeline that transported fuel from England to France were constructed. The entire operation, involving millions of soldiers and tons of equipment, had its epicenter in British ports and military bases where the troops concentrated in absolute secrecy. The Great Deception: How the Allies Misled Hitler. Espionage was key on D-Day, as the Allies managed to deceive Adolf Hitler into believing that the invasion would take place at the Pas de Calais instead of Normandy. To achieve this, they used various strategies. One of them was the creation of a ghost army under the command of General George Patton, composed of inflatable tanks and non-existent divisions that confused German reconnaissance aircraft. Additionally, radio transmissions were intensified in Kent to reinforce the deception. A crucial role was played by Spanish spy Joan Pujol, codenamed Garbo, who, operating as a double agent, convinced the Nazis that the real attack would occur at Calais. The Allied Air Force also contributed to the deception by bombing cities far from Normandy for months, including Le Mans, Tours, Paris, Reims, Brussels, Luxembourg, Cologne, and Aachen. In the days leading up to the operation, incidents occurred that made it seem as if the plan had been discovered. One of the strangest was the case of the Daily Telegraph crosswords, where words like Omaha, Utah, and Overlord appeared just before the landing. Another incident occurred when military documents flew through the streets of London due to the wind, and although they were quickly recovered, no one could assure that no one had read them. Also, an officer left a briefcase with details of the invasion on a train, while in the United States a package with information about Operation Overlord ended up at the wrong house because the sender made a mistake in sending it. Initially, the landing was scheduled for May the 15th, 1944, but sea conditions and lack of light led meteorologists to recommend postponing it. Two possible windows of good weather were identified: the days of June the 5th, 6th and 7th, or June the 19th, 20th and 21st. Finally, June the 5th was chosen, but a storm forced a delay. The soldiers, already embarked, spent hours soaked and anxious until the afternoon when an improvement in the weather was confirmed for June the 6th. Upon receiving the report, General Dwight Eisenhower gave the order, "Let's go." Just before the start of the invasion, Eisenhower had a tense meeting with Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French. The Frenchman reproached him for the Allies giving francs to their troops to spend in French territory. After the discussion, Eisenhower visited the American paratroopers who would depart that same night. He was surprised to see that many had their heads shaved with a mohawk, imitating the Mohican Indians. When asked the reason, one replied, "We want to finish quickly, General. We are in a hurry to get home." Eisenhower, with a smile, replied, "Me too." As night fell on June the 5th, thousands of ships set sail for France from the ports of Southampton, Dover, Portsmouth and Plymouth. Among them were destroyers, cruisers and landing craft, along with an air fleet that flew overhead. As the troops advanced through the English Channel, Eisenhower sent a motivational message to his soldiers, reminding them of the importance of the mission and the determination of the Allies to recover Europe. The Atlantic Wall in the absence of Rommel. It was an enormous network of coastal fortifications that the Third Reich erected from the North Cape in Norway to the Gulf of Biscay, right on the border with neutral Spain. This vast defensive system, described by the Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, as an impossible barrier to cross, aimed to stop any invasion attempt from England. Despite the impressive engineering effort it represented, its level of protection varied by area. The Pas de Calais had the strongest defenses, as Adolf Hitler was convinced that D-Day would occur there. However, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of the Western Front and former leader of the Afrika Korps, known as the Desert Fox, assured that the landing would take place on the beaches of Normandy. Although Rommel insisted that the Allied attack would occur in Normandy, Hitler remained convinced that the invasion point would be the Pas de Calais. His opinion prevailed, and as a result, reinforcements, including armoured divisions and V-1 missile ramps, were sent to the Franco-Belgian coastal strip of the North Sea, leaving Normandy in the background. Despite this, Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief of the Western Front, took into account Rommel's warnings, who emphasized to him, "The battle will be decided on the beach. It will be the longest day of the war." From his post at the Château de Fontainebleau, Rommel oversaw the defensive preparations of Army Group B in France, although his role was more technical than operational. The defensive system in Normandy consisted of about 10,000 fortifications, many connected by concrete walls, as well as a network of bunkers, trenches, and 170 coastal batteries protected by steel. In their arsenal, they had 88mm cannons, mortars, and MG-42 machine guns placed in strategic nests. In some cases, even armoured trains Leopold were installed. Against these defences, kilometres of barbed wire, 6 million mines, and vehicle barriers were deployed, in addition to obstacles such as logs, 4,500 concrete stakes, and 4,700 wooden stakes, anti-tank ditches, stone mounds, and 11,000 explosives attached to posts, known as Rommel's asparagus. He also designed other devices, such as 5,000 concrete tetrahedrons, to prevent passage, 2,400 barriers made with train rails, 16,000 submerged bars that perforated barges, and 7,000 porcelain mines, which were cheaper to produce. To stop the paratroopers, large areas of terrain were flooded, especially in the accesses to Normandy and the Cotentin Peninsula. The Axis contingent numbered 50,350 troops, with 41,000 Germans and more than 8,000 foreign volunteers from various areas, such as Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Central Asia, and even Korea, China, and Japan. The forces were distributed along the coasts of Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, with detachments tasked with protecting the coastline. In the rear guard, there were veterans of the Wehrmacht, members of the 21st Panzer Division, teenagers from the Hitler Youth, armed units of the Kriegsmarine, members of the Vichy French militia, and Luftwaffe personnel. On June 5, 1944, a day before the landing, several unexpected events complicated the German response. One of the most important was the absence of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who travelled to Herrlingen, Germany, to celebrate his wife Lucy's birthday, to whom he gave a pair of antelope shoes handmade in an exclusive Parisian shoe store. In his absence, command in France fell to General Gerd von Rundstedt, who ruled out the possibility of an Allied offensive due to poor weather conditions and did not activate the maximum alert. The Luftwaffe also did not intensify air surveillance and reduced its presence in the region, going from 140 aircraft to only 36, as most had been sent to the Soviet front days earlier. At the same time, military intelligence, led by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, ignored key warnings sent by the French resistance. During the night, the guerrillas transmitted a coded message to London with verses from the poet Paul Verlaine. The long sobs of the autumn violins wound my heart with a monotonous languor. The only high command that remained in his post that night was General Werner Pluskat, leader of the 352nd Infantry Division. From his position, accompanied by his dog and some soldiers, he observed the coast of Omaha, the sector where Operation Overlord would have its strongest impact. The night of D-Day, air operations and bridge control. At 3 minutes past midnight on June the 6th, 1944, 5 British Horsa gliders, towed by Lancaster bombers, were released in mid-flight over the Caen Canal, near the mouth of the Orne River. They descended rapidly without being detected by the German guards and landed between 20 and 40 meters from the Pegasus Bridge. Upon touching down, the commandos of the 22nd Independent Parachute Company, led by Major John Howard, immediately exited and took the structure by surprise. In the first skirmish, a German sentry and British Lieutenant Herman Brotheridge fell, becoming the first casualties of D-Day. The shootout on the walkway lasted less than a minute. The The commandos secured the bridge, neutralized the enemy garrison, and established their base in the Café Gondry, the first house liberated in France. At the same time, 3 other gliders landed 200 meters away and captured the rotating mechanism of the Ranville Bridge, suffering 16 casualties, including 2 dead and 14 wounded. With control of the Pegasus Bridge, the British only had to hold out until relieved by the troops that would land on Sword Beach in the morning. Around 10 minutes past midnight, American paratroopers jumped over the Cotentin Peninsula to prepare the landing of the airborne divisions. In parallel, British troops did the same near the Orne River to receive reinforcements. Meanwhile, Lancaster bombers struck German positions from Cherbourg to Caen, which received more than 11,000 tons of explosives, causing thousands of deaths and massive destruction. Within France, the resistance went into action, sabotaging communications and railways, causing the derailment of several enemy trains. Past midnight, 822 C-47 Dakota aircraft and 520 Horsa gliders departed from Great Britain with 13,100 paratroopers, 14 75mm cannons, and nearly 400 tons of supplies. In an attempt to confuse the Germans, 40 bombers dropped 450 rubber dummies with explosives in parachutes, while commandos with loudspeakers simulated combat. The distraction worked, and German forces sent reinforcements to that area, weakening their defense in the key landing points. At 20 minutes past 1 in the morning, aircraft with paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions crossed the sky over the Cotentin Peninsula. As soon as they were detected, searchlights illuminated the air, and German anti-aircraft batteries opened fire mercilessly. The attack caused a massacre. Multiple C-47 Dakotas were hit and exploded in mid-flight, throwing soldiers into the void. Others, trapped in the burning aircraft, fell along with the wreckage of their planes. To avoid further losses, the command ordered the jump with a shout of, "Go, go!" Loaded with 40 kilograms of equipment and an extra 25-kilogram bag with signaling material, thousands jumped into the void. However, many did not survive. Some were shot down while descending, others crashed due to parachute failures. Once on the ground, the nightmare continued. The Germans, already alerted, fired at those who managed to land. Others drowned in swamps, and some got stuck in trees and rooftops. The gliders did not fare better. Several crashed into flooded areas, and others crashed, leaving their occupants disoriented. The confusion was total. No one knew their exact position, and the dispersion was enormous. To communicate in the darkness, the Americans carried a whistle that imitated the sound of a frog, but the Germans captured one and used it to lure the soldiers into ambushes. During that fateful night, 42 C-47 Dakota transport aircraft were shot down, and 159 returned damaged to England. The Horsa gliders also suffered numerous casualties, including General Don Pratt, who died in a crash near Heysville. Some missions turned catastrophic, such as the attempt to take the Laporte bridges, where out of 575 soldiers, 168 were casualties, with 93 dead and 75 taken prisoner. In Neuville-au-Plain, 2 companies managed to take the place for a few hours, but a German counterattack forced them to retreat, leaving 28 dead. Another case was Saint-Côme, where the only survivor, Corporal Joseph Bell, fell on a church, was captured, and months later escaped from a prisoner of war camp to join the Red Army. Despite the dispersion, some groups fulfilled their mission, such as the 150 who secured the La Barquette lock, or those who took Chef du Pointe and the abandoned battery in Saint-Martin-de-Vareville. Only 10% of the paratroopers landed in the designated zone. The rest landed between 8 and 40 kilometers from the objective. Of all of them, only 44 returned to England, 35 due to injuries, and 9 due to desertion. One of the most dramatic episodes occurred in Sainte-Mère-Église, where a fire illuminated the area just as Company F of the 82nd Division was descending. The Germans, on alert, fired non-stop, eliminating almost all of them. Some were left hanging from trees or buildings, one was burned alive, and another slipped off the roof of a church. Only Private John Steele survived by pretending to be dead while hanging from the bell tower, although the constant ringing of the bells left him partially deaf. The 6th Airborne Division had a different experience. With 8,000 soldiers and 355 Horsa gliders, their mission was to destroy the bridges east of Normandy to prevent an enemy counterattack. The British successfully completed their task. They blew up the Bures Bridge after eliminating 6 armoured vehicles with Piat launchers, and a small group destroyed the Traun Bridge after infiltrating the enemy lines with a jeep. The Canadians, despite numerous casualties, managed to demolish the Varaville and Robehome bridges on the Devet River. Toward 3 o'clock in the morning, the last paratroopers touched down while the Allied Air Force relentlessly bombed the railway routes and communication centres in Normandy. The alarm had already been raised in Saint-Lô, but neither in Paris nor in Berlin was there a timely reaction. Meanwhile, the Allied fleet was between 11 and 15 nautical miles off the coast, with troops boarding landing craft. In parallel, a platoon led by Sergeant John Zanders landed on the islet of Saint-Marcouf. Although they managed to take the terrain, they suffered 19 casualties, including 2 killed by mines and booby traps. Assault on Merville and the landing at Utah. When the clock struck 35 minutes past 3 in the morning, soldiers of the 716th German Division finally located the British troops of Major John Howard at the Pegasus Bridge over the Orne River. The alert quickly reached a nearby detachment of the 21st Panzer Division, which sent a column of armoured vehicles to confront them. However, upon reaching the point of conflict, the advance was abruptly halted when one of the tanks was hit by a Piat anti-tank weapon fired by the British. This impact caused the Germans to retreat, convinced that the enemy had superior forces. To make matters worse, the British had captured a 50mm cannon from the German army itself and used it against them. Meanwhile, a few kilometers from the Orne River, British paratroopers of the 6th Airborne Division took control of Rainville around 35 minutes past 3. After eliminating the last German soldiers, they secured the area and cleared the nearby fields, removing explosives and wooden stakes to ensure the arrival of airborne reinforcements with daylight. One of the greatest achievements of the 6th Airborne Division was the capture of the Merville battery. Only 170 paratroopers led by Lieutenant Colonel Terence Otway participated in the assault, although the operation had been designed for 750 soldiers with additional weaponry. The situation became complicated when 6 Horsa gliders landed too far away, dispersing most of the fighters in the darkness of the Normandy forests. Despite this, they faced the 160 German defenders composed of artillerymen and combat engineers who resisted behind a mined field, double barbed wire, and several concrete bunkers. Shortly before the ground attack, the British Air Force bombed the position with 400 tons of explosives. Soon after, the paratroopers managed to open 4 breaches in the barbed wire and advanced under the cover of a Vickers machine gun. The hand-to-hand combat was brutal, but finally, the British took the position, leaving behind a high number of casualties. 65 between dead and wounded in their ranks, and 47 among the Germans, with 22 killed in action and 25 wounded. With the arrival of dawn on June 6, 1944, General Werner Pluskat, commander of the 1st Battalion of Fusiliers of the 352nd Infantry Division, observed from an elevated bunker over Omaha Beach. Beside him, his dog, which until then had been sleeping quietly, suddenly woke up and began barking for no apparent reason. As he directed his binoculars toward the horizon, the German officer noticed how the fog dissipated, and suddenly 6,000 Allied ships appeared ready to begin the invasion. At exactly 30 minutes past 5 in the morning, the Allied fleet opened fire on the 5 designated landing beaches. Battleships, cruisers and destroyers launched a rain of heavy and medium-caliber projectiles, while 38,000 rockets impacted the coast, leaving a landscape of craters and smoke. Immediately afterward, 1,641 aircraft of the Allied Air Force attacked the German positions. Heavy bombers B-17 and B-24 Liberator dropped tons of explosives from high altitude, and the B-26 Marauders, flying at lower altitude, added even more destruction. However, the precision of the bombings was deficient as they failed to hit key targets. Meanwhile, hundreds of landing craft advanced with thousands of American, British and Canadian soldiers on board. Many of them arrived exhausted after long hours of waiting, seasick from the waves, and some even vomiting due to the abundant breakfast they had consumed. In contrast, the German defenders, protected in bunkers and trenches, awaited, energetic and ready to repel the attack. At 30 minutes past 6 in the morning, the 4th Infantry Division landed on Utah Beach with 23,250 soldiers and 32 Sherman DD tanks. Due to a navigation error, the first wave arrived at a different section of the beach than planned, but paradoxically, this benefited them, as that area had been previously bombed by mistake. The resistance was weak, with a few German riflemen and mortars attempting to halt the advance without success. The American troops quickly opened a breach in the cement seawall. From the ground, General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, rallied his men with determination. "Let's start the battle from here." Thanks to this initial advantage, the Allied forces neutralized the main defensive positions without encountering significant opposition. The WN-10 and WN-5 strongpoints in La Madeleine were cleared, although before being taken, the latter destroyed a Sherman DD tank. The STP-9 fortification was rendered inoperative after the attack of the B-26 Marauder bombers, while the main bunker of the Azeville battery was disabled after the impact of a 105mm projectile, which killed its entire crew. The only German position that resisted fiercely was the Krisbeck battery, equipped with Skoda 210mm cannons and a Soviet 150mm howitzer, as well as several additional military structures. Despite the intense naval bombardment of the battleships USS Nevada, USS Arkansas, and USS Texas, along with the air attack of 150 B-17 and B-24 bombers, only 3 cannons were destroyed. The only one that remained operational managed to hit and sink the destroyer USS Corrie, causing the death of 4 crew members. However, Utah Beach was quickly secured, with a toll of 429 Allied casualties and the loss of 4 Sherman DD tanks, 2 of which were swallowed by the waves. The bloody landing at Omaha and the mission at Pointe du Hoc. Omaha Beach became the key point of the landing in Normandy and at the same time the bloodiest scenario. Before the arrival of the troops, the US fleet launched a preliminary bombardment with 20 warships, including the battleships USS Texas and USS Arkansas, as well as cruisers and destroyers. Minutes later, 9 vessels equipped with rocket launchers fired more than 1,127mm projectiles from a distance of 4,500 meters. However, the attack did not hit the targets. Many projectiles fell short, others overshot their marks, and the result was devastating. When the assault began, the fortifications remained intact and fully operational. The defense of the 8 kilometers of coast was in the hands of about 7,000 German soldiers positioned on 50-meter-high cliffs, giving them a strategic advantage. The weaponry they had included artillery, mortars, rocket launchers, and anti-tank pieces, as well as hundreds of obstacles placed in the water and on the sand to prevent the arrival of the Allied forces. At various distances from the shore, there were stakes with explosives, metal structures, and other elements designed to disable the landing craft before they reached the beach. At 36 minutes past 6 in the morning, the 34,250 soldiers of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions advanced toward the shore. From before arriving, the German batteries opened fire and destroyed several craft in the middle of the English Channel. Others were dragged by the current until they collided with underwater obstacles, becoming inoperative. The transports that managed to reach the beach opened their ramps, and at that moment, horror unfolded. Some soldiers, upon jumping into the water, were sunk by the weight of their backpacks and drowned. Others fell under enemy fire before taking a single step. The landing craft became deadly traps, with men trapped inside while German machine guns mowed them down. The troops that managed to get out were forced to advance through a minefield of explosions and gunfire. In the first minutes, many units were practically annihilated. In the Mount Les Moulins sector, all the officers and non-commissioned officers of the 116th Regiment were shot down in a matter of minutes. Of the 29 Sherman DD tanks that were supposed to provide support, only 2 managed to reach the shore, although they were immobilized before they could intervene in the battle. With casualties that in some sectors exceeded 75%, the survivors had to dig holes in the sand and seek refuge behind any obstacle that offered minimal protection. The landing at Omaha, at that moment, seemed doomed to failure. Meanwhile, between Utah and Omaha, a group of 255 Rangers landed on the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc at 10 minutes past 7. Their mission was to take control of the German position, where it was believed there were 6 155mm cannons protected by bunkers and machine gun nests. The USS Texas and the Air Force had attempted to weaken the defenses with an intense bombardment, but once again, the enemy artillery remained intact. From the top of the cliffs, the Germans had a clear view of the assault and fired relentlessly at the soldiers trapped on the beach. The Rangers, equipped with grappling hooks and ropes launched with grapnels, began to climb the rock walls. Some ropes were cut by the Germans, causing the soldiers to plummet to the void. Others were shot down mid-climb. Despite the losses, with the support of the destroyer USS Satterlee, they managed to reach the top after an exhausting 40-minute effort. There, they fought hand-to-hand in the trenches and cleared the bunkers until they forced the defenders to retreat. However, upon inspecting the area, they discovered that the cannons were not there. The Germans had removed them previously and moved them inland. The sacrifice of 135 Rangers in the climb had been in vain. Later, during a reconnaissance, Brigadier Leonard Lommel and Sergeant Jack Kuhn found the artillery pieces abandoned 600 meters away. Without hesitation, they threw grenades into their tubes and disabled them, thus ensuring that they could not be used against the Allied forces. The assault on Gold and Juno, fire and resistance. At 25 minutes past 7, British troops entered combat on Gold Beach. During the approach, the wind suddenly changed, diverting vessels and generating waves that sank 4 LCI barges, while 11 became stuck among submerged obstacles. However, when the 24,970 soldiers of the British landed, the 51st Infantry Division Northumbrian, along with the 8th Armoured Brigade and the 47th Royal Marine Commando, advanced through the sand and overcame the embankments, facing the defenders, who were dispersed and without time to organize. Only in Hamel, a fortified seaside resort, was there a significant delay, as its Russian white defenders destroyed 3 Sherman DD tanks and left 60 casualties, with 20 dead and 40 wounded. Nevertheless, after the surrender of the garrison, the British were able to continue inland. In another part of the coast, a concealed 88mm cannon at the King position managed to hit several armoured vehicles of the Royal Dragoons, but it was destroyed when 3 Churchills attacked it. Something similar happened at the WN-34 strongpoint, where another Flak 88 was eliminated before the British occupied both the lighthouse and La Rivière. During these clashes, they captured 30 German soldiers, although they lost 90 men, with 30 dead and 60 wounded, as well as several armoured vehicles. A few hours later, Sergeant Major Stanley Hollis stormed into the Normandy countryside and, upon reaching Villa Palangana, threw a grenade into a bunker, eliminating those inside. Then, armed with a Sten submachine gun, he cleared the nearby trenches, securing full control of Gold Beach, an action for which he received the Victoria Cross. At 35 minutes past 7, the Canadians landed on Juno Beach. With 21,400 men from the 3rd Infantry Division, they faced strong resistance, as the preliminary bombardment had only managed to damage 14% of the enemy fortifications. The area was defended by the 716th German Division and Russian White units, which had artillery, mortars, and machine guns at their disposal. During the landing, many vessels hit mines hidden in the reefs, causing a massacre. Of the 24 barges in the first wave, 20 sank in deep waters before reaching the beach. Once on land, the Canadians experienced one of the bloodiest battles of D-Day, second only to the carnage on Omaha Beach. In Courcelles, the fighting was fierce, with losses exceeding 40% of the original forces. In some cases, like Company D, out of 180 men, only 49 remained standing. The situation worsened when 2 German Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters appeared at low altitude, strafing the troops and destroying several vehicles. Despite this, The soldiers managed to open a path when Lieutenant Bill Grayson disabled a bunker with a grenade and, together with his unit, captured 35 enemies, finally allowing the exit from the beach. After this achievement, the Allies managed to take Courcelles, expelling the German soldiers from the barricades. They also secured Mauvaises and Bernières, the latter occupied by the Queen's Own Rifles battalion. However, the resistance was much stronger at the Warn 27 strongpoint, where the defenders managed to destroy 4 tanks, 2 Sherman DDs and 2 Churchills before being neutralized, and a machine gun downed a P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bomber. The commandos attempted to take Langrune-sur-Mer, but due to the reinforced defenses with thick concrete walls and an extensive minefield, the assault ended in retreat with 300 casualties. Apart from this point, the rest of Juno Beach was secured by the Canadian troops, who in the process suffered 1,035 casualties, with 335 dead and 700 wounded. Sword, honor and steel on the last beach. The last landing took place on Sword Beach at 7:35, where 28,845 British and Scottish soldiers, along with volunteers from France, Belgium, Poland, Norway, Hungary, Greece and Austria, faced the enemy defence on a 6-kilometre coastal strip. To clear the way, the naval artillery bombarded the positions in Villaville, Benneville, Houlgate and Mount Canisy with 2 battleships, 6 cruisers, 1 monitor and 10 destroyers. However, a German S-boot torpedo boat counterattacked, launching 15 torpedoes and sinking the Norwegian destroyer Chemnoes Svena with a single hit. The development of the landing on Sword Beach took a turn when the British took control under the direction of General Lord Simon Lovat, who led his troops to the sound of Bill Millin's bagpipe. Once the territory on the coast was secured, the 120 strongpoint in Le Brèche was eliminated, and a group of Royal Marines captured Lyon-sur-Mer, although 30 soldiers lost their lives in the operation. Additionally, the British destroyed the battery of the 1-8 strongpoint, took Hermanville after firing more than 50 shells with Churchill tanks against the W18 strongpoint, forced 70 artillerymen to surrender at the Famine 12 strongpoint, and took the Colline Perrier Hill and the Famine 14 strongpoint without difficulty. The only significant delay occurred at the Dubin 16 strongpoint in Colleville, where sustained bombardment by the Polish cruiser ORP Dragon and the destroyer HMS Kelvin was required until the Suffolk Infantry Battalion achieved the surrender of the 67 German soldiers defending the position. Shortly afterward, the mayor of the town presented himself at the site and, as a gesture of gratitude, offered a bottle of Calvados liqueur to Corporal Fred Ashby and his men. Thus ended the battle for Sword Beach, with a toll of 520 Allied casualties, including 120 dead and 400 wounded, as well as the loss of 17 Sherman DD tanks. Despite the success, the landing of heavy equipment suffered delays due to the large number of underwater obstacles, causing a backlog of material on the shore. Meanwhile, around 8 o'clock in the morning, Adolf Hitler awoke and received the news of the invasion in Normandy. He immediately convened an emergency meeting with the German High Command, where Generals Wilhelm von Keitel and Alfred Jodl informed him of the situation on the front. Far from being alarmed, he showed confidence in the development of the battle and ordered the mobilization of the 21st Panzer Division, stating, "Finally, we have them on the continent. Now we can destroy them." At 9 o'clock in the morning, the Nazi regime broadcast the announcement of the invasion to the German population. 10 minutes later, the US government and Prime Minister Winston Churchill did the same, informing their citizens in Washington and London, while in the British capital, a crowd gathered in front of the Cenotaph Memorial, erected in memory of the fallen of the First World War. Nest number 62 and the Beast of Omaha, 12,000 shots in the hell of Normandy. On Omaha Beach, the situation was a complete disaster compared to what was happening in other areas of the landing in Normandy. The Americans had not managed to take the key points and had barely secured a few secondary ones. One of them was the Pointe du Raz de la Percée promontory, which fell into their hands after a brutal fight in which, of the 64 soldiers sent, only 29 survived. Another point was the Bayonne 65 strongpoint, neutralized after the direct impact of a half-track M3 anti-aircraft semi-track, while the WN-61 Strongpoint was destroyed along with its 2 cannons when a Sherman DD tank managed to score a direct hit, although before that, its gunners had destroyed 4 enemy armored vehicles on the shore. Despite these small advances and the opening of a narrow path in Saint-Laurent, the overall panorama was desolate. In the easy sector, 2 companies accidentally landed in front of the fortified WN-67 and WN-68 positions, where they were completely wiped out. However, the worst episode occurred in the Dog Green sector near Merville, where 600 Americans died facing only 54 German defenders who had the advantage of being well protected behind concrete fortifications in the Bien 72 and Bien 73 strongpoints, as well as an old hotel reinforced as a resistance point. The most critical point of the entire battle at Omaha was the assault on the WN-62 strongpoint, where the US First Army faced one of its toughest tests in the invasion. Initially, the position was defended by only 31 soldiers under the command of Lieutenant Bernhard Fröking. However, they had a powerful line of defense that included 2 75mm cannons, another 2 50mm cannons, mortars, heavy machine guns, and bunkers equipped with flamethrowers. From before touching land, the attackers already suffered enormous casualties. The enemy artillery destroyed 12 of the 13 landing craft in the first wave, forcing many to jump into the water and travel nearly 50 meters to the shore. Once there, the obstacles were overwhelming. 150 meters of exposed sand, trap explosives, barbed wire, trenches filled with mud, stakes with mines, and a 3-meter wall blocking the advance. The result was a bloodbath, with most of the vehicles disabled and 58 of the 78 trucks and jeeps destroyed. The only effective support came from the destroyers at sea, whose cannons managed to damage one of the bunkers with 36 direct hits. Among those who witnessed the horror was Robert Capa, the photographer who nearly lost his life in the midst of the chaos, but managed to capture 11 images of that hell before being urgently evacuated. However, the most feared figure of that day was Corporal Heinrich Sevelow, who, entrenched in nest number 62, fired 12,000 rounds with his MG-42 machine gun, causing hundreds of casualties before running out of ammunition and being captured. His lethal efficiency earned him a name that would be marked in history: the Beast of Omaha. Meanwhile, on Omaha Beach, the situation was an absolute disaster compared to the rest of Normandy. They had not achieved the main objectives and had barely secured a few secondary ones, such as the Pointe du Raz de la Percée promontory, which was secured by the troops at the cost of 35 of the 64 men who participated in the assault. Also, the WN-65 Strongpoint fell, destroyed after the direct impact of a half-track M3 anti-aircraft semi-track, and the WN-61 Strongpoint, whose 2 cannons were annihilated by the shot of one of the few available Sherman DD tanks, although its crew had previously destroyed 4 enemy armored vehicles on the shore. Beyond these isolated cases and a small opening in Saint-Laurent, the advance was a real ordeal. In the easy sector, by mistake, 2 companies landed right in front of the German positions WN-67 and WN-68, where they were completely massacred. However, the worst occurred in Dog Green near Merville, where 600 Americans lost their lives against only 54 Germans, the latter protected behind the concrete structures of the WN-72 and WN-73 strongpoints, as well as an old hotel reinforced by engineers. The toughest point for the US First Army in Normandy was the WN-62 strongpoint on Omaha Beach. Although initially it only had 31 German soldiers under the command of Lieutenant Bernhard Fröking, the fortification was equipped with 2 bunkers, 4 cannons of different calibers, 3 mortars, 4 machine guns, and 2 fortified positions with flamethrowers. Before reaching the shore, the first wave had already been decimated. The artillery sank or disabled 12 of the 13 landing craft. Many soldiers had to advance with the water up to their waists for nearly 50 meters to reach solid ground. Once on the beach, they faced a hellish terrain with more than 150 meters of obstacles, posts with mines, stakes, a 3-meter drop, a ditch full of mud, barbed wire, a minefield, and trenches. The slaughter was brutal. Vehicles were reduced to wreckage, with 58 of the 78 original trucks or jeeps destroyed. The only support came from the naval destroyers, which hit one of the enemy bunkers with 36 projectiles. In the midst of that inferno, photographer Robert Capa, who accompanied the troops, came close to death, but managed to take 11 striking images before being evacuated. However, the main protagonist of the day was Corporal Heinrich Sverlo. From nest number 62, he fired 12,000 bullets with his MG-42 machine gun, leaving hundreds of casualties until he ran out of ammunition and was captured. Since then, he has been known as the Beast of Omaha. At midday, the British on Sword Beach encountered a new obstacle. After taking Port-en-Bessin, the backlog of vessels once again paralyzed the area. Something similar happened in Juno, where the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division, after taking Bernières, found itself trapped in a traffic jam that blocked the passage of reinforcements. In the interior, the American Airborne divisions faced strong German resistance, and the French resistance was unable to assist as expected, as it was engaged in clashes with the Vichy militia. There were sectors where the advance was easier, especially against foreign troops of the Axis. Many Russian whites, Georgians and Muslims surrendered after brief skirmishes, although there were exceptions. A 17-year-old Ukrainian soldier, Ali Balabanov, held his machine gun position for hours, eliminating several British soldiers, while the Korean Kyung Jong-yang also caused casualties before being captured on Omaha Beach. In the woods of Brécourt, located a few kilometers from the coast, the Germans fired with a battery of 4 105mm cannons, causing numerous casualties among the American troops. Fortunately, a group of 30 paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division, under the command of Richard Winters and belonging to Easy Company, surprised the 50 German artillerymen defending the site with 2 MG-42 machine guns from the rear. Against all odds, they managed to eliminate the cannons after a successful assault, causing 20 enemy casualties and capturing 12 soldiers. The Americans, on the other hand, suffered only 6 casualties, with 4 dead and 2 wounded. This attack, which became a reference in military academies, was not the only blow to the German defences. In Holdy, a similar battery of 4 cannons was neutralized when a group of 32 paratroopers took advantage of the confusion caused by the explosion of an ammunition depot. In the clash, 15 Germans were killed and 30 were taken prisoner, leaving only 15 to escape. As the morning progressed, the situation in Normandy began to improve. In Utah Beach, the Americans advanced 3 kilometers until they linked up with the paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division, who had already suffered the loss of most of their forces in the nearby woods. Meanwhile, the Canadians managed to liberate Juno Beach, while the British replaced the paratrooper unit of John Howard at the Pegasus Bridge. In Ouistreham, the Free French Commando, composed of 177 fighters, razed the urban area until they took control of the place, making it the first territory under French dominion after the invasion. However, the German batteries continued to wreak havoc on the Allied fleet, sinking the British destroyer HMS Wrestler and the American submarine chaser USS PC-162. Toward 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the German resistance in Omaha Beach made the battle seem impossible to win. The enemy fire pinned down the soldiers, forcing them to take cover behind the natural protection offered by the cliff. Neither the P-51 Mustang fighter bombers nor the shelling from the fleet's ships managed to weaken the German defenses, protected in almost impregnable fortifications. Faced with this scenario, General Omar Bradley seriously considered withdrawing the troops, which would have meant the failure of D-Day. But on the sand, there was still one man who was not willing to give up. General Norman Cotter, the only high-ranking officer still alive in the dog-green sector of Vierville, addressed his soldiers with a phrase that would mark history. There are only 2 kinds of men out here, those who are already dead and those who are about to die. Inspired by these words, the American soldiers gathered all the dynamite and explosives they could find among the dunes. Although many were shot down by enemy snipers, they managed to collect 500 kilograms of C4, which they placed at the base of the Atlantic Wall. When the charge was detonated, a colossal explosion launched debris and shrapnel into the air, leaving a large breach in the German defensive structure. Taking advantage of the confusion, the soldiers emerged from their hiding places and launched an attack, engaging the Germans in hand-to-hand combat. In less than an hour, the American troops managed to conquer the Atlantic Wall and raise their flag at the highest point, thus sealing a crucial victory in the landing in Normandy. The massacre. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon on June the 6th, 1944, the last shots on Omaha beach marked the end of the landing in Normandy and the beginning of the invasion of France. The battle, which had started after midnight, extended for nearly 14 hours. Surprisingly, the defensive barrier that the Germans had taken 4 years to build fell in less than a day. The Allied forces recorded around 12,000 casualties, including dead, wounded, and prisoners. Of that total, the United States suffered approximately 6,000, the United Kingdom nearly 4,000, Canada 987, and Allied countries to a lesser extent, such as Norway with 32 and the Free French with 12. In terms of equipment, the losses were significant. 34 tanks destroyed, 127 aircraft shot down, and nearly 300 vessels sunk, including 3 destroyers and multiple landing craft. On the German side, the losses amounted to around 6,000 casualties, half that of their opponents, with 2,000 soldiers killed and 4,000 captured. Paradoxically, the country that suffered the most deaths on D-Day was France due to the Allied bombings. In total, it is estimated that 10,000 civilians died, and twice as many were wounded in the attacks on Normandy, the Cotentin Peninsula, and Caen. With the taking of the beaches, the long-awaited Second Front was finally opened. From then on, Germany was forced to fight on 2 fronts, the Soviets pushing from the east and the Western forces advancing from the west. Rommel, who had insisted to Hitler on reinforcing Normandy instead of Calais, was proven right. Soon, the German army showed that it was not prepared to contain the Allies, especially when the offensive of the Red Army in Belorussia forced Germany to spread its troops across the continent. This accelerated the Allied advance and led to the fall of Paris in August of that year. June the 6th, 1944, was marked as one of the most decisive days of the 20th century. Not only did it secure the triumph of the Allies, but it also established their presence in Europe before the Soviet Union could take more territory. However, the human cost was extremely high, with thousands of soldiers killed on the beaches and paratroopers who never touched the ground alive. For all these reasons, D-Day would go down in history with the name that best defines it: the longest day. The Normandy landing was one of the most decisive events of World War II. What began as a risky amphibious invasion ended up marking the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. In just 14 hours of battle, the Allies achieved what seemed impossible: overcoming the Atlantic Wall and establishing a foothold in Western Europe. However, the cost was devastating. More than 12,000 casualties among the invaders and a similar figure among the German defenders attested to the brutality of the combat. Despite the military success, Normandy also became a hell for the civilian population. France, paradoxically, was the country with the most losses that day, with at least 10,000 civilians killed by Allied bombings. The massacre on Omaha Beach, the resistance in the German positions, and the fierce defense of the strongpoints were witnesses to the cruelty of the conflict. D-Day not only defined the outcome of the war, but also changed the geopolitics of the world. With the fall of Paris in August 1944 and the advance of the Soviets from the east, Germany's fate was sealed. Thus, the longest day was engraved in history as the day that marked the beginning of the liberation of Europe.